A few days ago, the Salvadoran president and self-described world coolest dictator got an Oval Office audience in the White House. In the middle of a global market meltdown orchestrated by the very guy who, when he decides to go to work, calls that room his office, you would think had more pressing matters at hand. But there they were, and when asked by the press why he, Trump, hadn't complied with the Supreme Court order to return Kilmer Garcia to the U.S., after his own administration agreed it had wrongly deported him to a notorious maximum security prison in El Salvador, Trump suddenly said he'd love to if only President Bukele would let him. At this point, our coolest dictator called the request preposterous. As a reminder, the U.S. is paying the Salvadoran leader millions annually to take these deportees off U.S. hands, and Trump is the same guy, if memory serves, who has threatened to take over Greenland, Panama, Gaza, and thrown out of the same White House the Ukrainian president for not groveling properly. So the idea that Trump is afraid to offend, especially to a guy in his payroll, is offensively disingenuous. No, Trump doesn't want to bring this guy back because he fundamentally doesn't believe in human decency and congenitally cannot do the right thing. Mr. Garcia was illegally removed because no due process as required by law was employed. But for anybody who says, who cares, the guy was an illegal gangbanger, well, why don't we consider a thing that's, in rare supply in Trump world called facts. Garcia came to the U.S. in 2011 when he was 16. Garcia married a U.S. citizen. They have an American child, and he has maintained steady employment and hasn't gotten in any trouble. But without any evidence, he was supposedly part of a gang, let alone a terrorist, as the Salvadoran president alleged, and with that he was sent with hundreds of men, more than 90% of whom have no criminal record, to El Salvador. In a perversity, Garcia has fewer criminal convictions than our president, whose own administration acknowledged their error in shipping him to a foreign prison where a federal judge in the U.S. had found previously he had a reasonable fear of persecution for gangs that he fled when he came to the U.S. as a teen. Now, this, of course, doesn't happen in a vacuum. It never does when it comes to Trump. A U.S. District Court judge ruled yesterday that probable cause exists to hold Trump administration officials in criminal contempt for violating his orders last month to halt deporting alleged gang members without any evidence or day in court from Venezuela. Now, if you remember, the court ordered the administration to ground a deportation flight that the administration then ignored and later claimed it couldn't turn the plane around in time. In response to every judiciary directive that it needed to follow the rule of law and the Constitution, Trump and team, they winked and effectively said, sorry. But as we know, they're not sorry. In fact, in the same meeting with the coolest dictator, Trump told the president that he needed to build 5 more prisons in this country because the homegrowns, in his words, are next. Now, I know Trump lies like he breathes, but this time it ain't idle chatter. In the Supreme Court's ruling last week, Justice Sotomayor wrote in a statement that ran unopposed, and it said in part the following, quote, "The government's argument implies that it could deport and incarcerate any person, including U.S. citizens, without legal consequence, so long as it does so before a court can intervene," end quote. This, my friends, is presidential lawlessness, or effectively an administration and de facto a dictator can ignore any ruling it disagrees with. If the case against Mr. Garcia and the other defendants weren't supported by evidence, the White House, they wouldn't have gone to the lengths they did to break the law. But if we have learned anything in the first 85 days of Trump 2.0, it's that there is no line he won't cross, no precedent he won't respect, no check and balance that he believes do not apply to him. So please, consider this as the Supreme Court will eventually have to decide whether or not to declare unilaterally he has gone too far. At that point, what then? Abreu Garcia is only the first name. What they could do to him, they could do to any of us.